The air hung heavy with incense, but it carried no prayer. Aromatic smoke twisted through narrow cobblestone streets, not to sanctify, but to survive. Citizens clutched sprigs of rosemary. In trembling hands, tucked lavender into makeshift masks, and burned bundles of juniper in their darkened homes. Physicians roamed the alleys in layered robes, gripping long canes, not to heal, but to keep distance from their patients. They were not saving lives. They were fleeing, death in slow motion, their movements dictated by terror as much as duty. Across Europe, the Black Death tore through cities with a speed unmatched in living memory. But for many, the horror didn't end with the disease. It began with the cure. In a world without germ theory, without antibiotics, and without hope, medicine became improvisation. Or worse, it became commerce. And in the hands of the desperate and the greedy, it became deadly. Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the collapse of Florence firsthand, recorded what many dared not voice. Physicians, he wrote without knowledge, treated at random. Many remedies proved deadlier than the disease. The streets were littered not only with the bodies of plague victims, but with those who had died from the very treatments meant to save them. The line between healer and executioner blurred until it disappeared entirely. The most common cure was also one of the most dangerous, bloodletting, based on the ancient humoral theory which held that illness arose from an imbalance of bodily fluids. Physicians believed they could restore health by draining bad blood. In practice, it drained the last strength of the dying. Guy de Chauliac, papal physician in Avignon, warned that doctors who treated by bloodletting were more likely to perish. He had stayed when others fled, and watched as both his patients and fellow physicians died. Some from the plague, others, perhaps, from the knives meant to cure them. In Paris, the king's own faculty of medicine issued a solemn pronouncement. The stars had caused the pestilence, they declared. Their advice? Purge the body. Physicians must purge the body with bloodletting, they wrote in Compendium de Epidemia, codifying a practice that often worsened the patient's fate. The proclamation carried the weight of royal authority, and so the practice spread, sanctioned by the highest minds of the age. But authority did not make it true, and the dying paid the price. But there was no shortage of remedies: powdered pearls, crushed emeralds, crushed snakes, and drinks laced with arsenic or mercury. These were sold in panic-ridden markets, peddled by self-declared healers who grew rich off desperation. In London's East Smithfield Cemetery, archaeologists uncovered bottles of mercury and arsenic, buried with plague victims. Silent testimony to treatments that were not just ineffective, but fatal. The cures themselves became killers, and those who sold them knew it. Governments, too, took notice. In Venice, where trade made the city both wealthy and vulnerable, the authorities declared that no man shall sell cures for the pestilence without license, under penalty of death. The law made clear what the suffering already knew. The cure could be a lie, and that lie could kill. Could you survive, knowing the hands that claimed to heal might instead deliver the final blow? Messina, Sicily, October 1347. At the edge of the city, where the harbor meets the hills, the plague had just landed. Victims fell faster than they could be buried. In the heat and panic, corpses were piled into trenches dug hastily in the earth. Some of them still moved. From this earliest European entry point of the Black Death, chronicler Michael of Piazza wrote that the living could hardly be distinguished from the dead. So quickly were they buried. The statement was not metaphorical. As the bodies mounted and the stench overwhelmed the air, fear replaced discernment. In some cases, there was no time or will to wait for death to confirm itself. By the following year, the nightmare had spread to nearly every corner of Europe. In England, the monk John of Reading described a chilling collapse of custom and care. The dead and nearly dead alike were cast into graves, he wrote, for none dared draw near to judge who still breathed. In the chaos of plague pits, shallow, overcrowded, and rapidly filled, it became a matter of risk management. If someone didn't stir, they were assumed lost. If they did, it was sometimes too late. France offers another perspective, just as grim. Jean de Venette, a Carmelite friar in Paris, recorded that gravediggers, driven by panic and their own vulnerability, placed even the unconscious into pits if they stirred not for a moment. In the most tragic cases, the very weakness of a victim, faint breath, fevered stillness, became their undoing. The fear of being buried alive was not just the product of rumor or superstition. It was embedded into official action. In 1348, the city of Marseille passed a regulation that ordered no family shall delay burial longer than 1 hour after the priest's departure. This law, aimed at curbing contagion, required families to bury loved ones with little delay, sometimes before death could be fully confirmed, making tragic mistakes all but certain. This was the plague's most terrifying prospect, not merely to die, but to vanish without ceremony, to be discarded before death had run its full course. The horror of being buried alive was not a medieval exaggeration. It was a systemic failure of human judgment under extreme collapse. In a time when the dying could not speak for themselves, silence could be mistaken for death. And movement, when it came, might come too late. The Black Death didn't just overwhelm cities. It stripped them of their last safeguard, certainty, and in doing so it made being buried alive not a myth, but a very real and present fear, one more layer in the unfolding nightmare of a world in plague. Strasbourg, February 1349. In the city's Jewish cemetery, wooden platforms had been hastily constructed. By evening, the crowd had gathered, not for mourning, but for execution. Over 1,000 men, women, and children accused of poisoning wells and spreading plague were marched to their deaths. Chronicler Jacob von Königshofen described the event. They were placed on wooden platforms in their own graveyard, more than 1,000. Men, women, and children. They were not granted burial elsewhere. Their deaths, like the plague that incited them, were meant to cleanse. As the Black Death tore through Europe, killing tens of millions, it also unraveled society's grasp on logic. Fear demanded answers, and in many cities, answers came in the form of blame, directed at Jewish communities who, despite suffering from the plague themselves, were scapegoated with claims of well poisoning and sorcery. In Bern, Switzerland, these accusations took official form. Under torture, Jewish residents confessed to crimes they never committed. Trial transcripts survive from 1348, describing how, in the presence of inquisitors, Jews admitted to spreading plague powder into water sources. The so-called evidence was extracted through coercion, used not to investigate, but to justify execution. This was not just a wave of mob violence. It was sanctioned, documented, and systematized. Nowhere was this more explicit than in Basel. In January 1349, the city council issued a decree. The city shall be cleansed of the enemies of the people, let them be burned. Within days, the city's entire Jewish population, hundreds of residents, was forcibly removed and executed. Survivors were banned from returning for 200 years. The execution became an act of civic purification, ordered by authority, not rage alone. In Erfurt, the horror reached into sacred space. A Latin account from the time records they sealed the synagogue and set it alight. The synagogue, a house of prayer and community, was turned into a site of execution. This was more than retribution. It was symbolic annihilation. The building burned, with its people trapped inside. Yet not every ruler succumbed to hysteria. In Aragon, King Pedro IV issued a rare and remarkable edict in 1348. He warned his subjects, "Let no Christian dare to injure a Jew for the pestilence unless proof is found." In the midst of panic, one monarch insisted on legal restraint, a signal that the machinery of justice, though fragile, had not entirely collapsed. Still, such acts of protection were exceptions. In most of plague-era Europe, accusations spread faster than infection, and those accused, particularly Jewish communities, often faced the plague not once, but twice, first in disease and then in flames. The Black Death did not simply kill bodies. It corrupted the trust that held communities together. When that broke, execution became ritual. And fire, not fever, became the final judgment. Cures killed, fear buried the breathing, and fire consumed the falsely accused, reshaping European society and faith in institutions. Its echoes still test us whenever panic seeks. Scapegoats, comment below. In your view, which reaction to the plague was most destructive? Misguided medicine, mass hysteria, or the loss of justice? As Giovanni Boccaccio lamented in 1348, no wisdom, foresight, or diligence appeared of any avail. The mortal pestilence prevailed.